philosopher, once said that tears are our first words. It's the way we all come into this world, crying. And as some of the more cynical among us might argue, it's then how we spend the rest of our lives. I mean, what's the old saying? We all come into this world naked, wet, and crying, and from there things only get worse. Whatever, it is our first language, our first words, a voice we all share at our deepest level. It's the language of tears. Do you ever cry? What sort of things make you cry? Current struggles, painful memories, the suffering of loved ones, unresolved grief, failures, shame, worry, Hallmark commercials. When was the last time you cried and why? And even more importantly, what became of your tears? This is something of what I'd like to talk about this morning, our tears. Today in our continuing overview of the Old Testament, we jump forward a number of centuries in the story. As we've noted over the last few weeks, following the heights of Israel's prosperity and power as a united kingdom under Kings Saul, David, and Solomon, the nation then separated into two competing kingdoms, north and south. Well, as the years passed, these two grew further apart from one another and from the Lord. And through the prophets, God repeatedly tried to bring the people back to him, but they refused. And as a result, weakened, disjointed, and faithless, they eventually become a conquered people, first by the Assyrians in 722 BC, and then by the Babylonian Empire in 587 BC. The Babylonians carry many of the people of Israel away into captivity. It is what is known as the time of the exile. Their homeland lost, overrun, destroyed, the people now living in captivity and slavery in a foreign land. From Israel's highest point, this is now their lowest. Well, throughout all this rise and fall, one of the primary voices of the people's experiences and faith, their joys and their struggles, is the book of Psalms. Psalms is essentially the hymnal for the people of Israel, their book of worship that consists of songs and poetry and prayers. And many of the Psalms are attributed to King David, a great musician in his own right. And such attributions are not uncommon in ancient times, an ordinary person who was ascribing their work to some higher personage. However, as is well understood, most of the Psalms were actually written by various people at many times over many centuries, and particularly many being composed during the time of the exile, and such being the case of our reading today. The text is ascribed to David when he was held captive by his enemy, the Philistines, but from this is meant to reflect all the people's experiences as they are now held captive by their enemy, the Babylonians. In our reading today, the author, the psalmist in exile, is obviously struggling profoundly. He or she is in the worst, most difficult time of their life. And this, of course, is nothing new. Many of the Psalms deal with the author struggling with hardship or adversity. What's interesting about this text, however, is an image, an unusual word picture that the author uses as part of his struggle. Psalm 56, verse 8, speaking to the Lord, the psalmist says, "You have kept count of my tossings. Put my tears in your bottle. Put my tears in your bottle." A most unusual request. As one scholar writes, in this particular psalm, it's not the tears of the psalmist that are new. The psalmist is often talking about tears. What is remarkable is the writer's hope for those tears. "Lord, put them in your bottle," he pleads. What on earth is meant by this? Well, in her book, Strange Scriptures That Perplex the Western World, author Barbara Bowen provides some background on the image that the psalmist may be referring to here. She describes an ancient custom prevalent in many cultures of collecting the tears of family and preserving the tears in bottles. When death or serious trouble occurred, each member of the family brought his or her tear bottle and collected the tears of all those persons present. These bottles were sacred to the family members because they represented all the sorrows of the family. And each person was then buried with his or her tear bottle. And many of these have been found in ancient tombs. The point of this custom was that the tears not be lost, that they might not just fall to the ground forgotten, but rather that they are crucial parts of the family's life, what make them who they are, and thus they must not be wasted. And this, it is believed, is what the psalmist is getting at here. The psalmist is praying that somehow God would take his tears, hold on to them and use them, make them God's own, and in this redeem them and redeem him. He is in effect asking that his tears not be wasted. And this, I believe, is a crucial lesson for us all. So often we go through life with the unspoken, and at times even spoken, understanding that in some sort of strange Darwinian survival of the fittest kind of way, that which does not kill us makes us stronger. That is, the suffering and pain and sorrow, if we can just be strong and stoic and endure them, will somehow automatically be good for us, that they will teach us and purify us and better us. A belief, of course, that we generally like better to suggest to others than to actually live ourselves. But the plain fact is that this is just downright false. Suffering and pain do not automatically make anything better. Quite the contrary. Quite often, they destroy and desolate lives. For every person that has been made better by their pain, I can show you 10 who have been wiped out by it. So what makes the difference? To paraphrase an old saying, why in suffering do some get better and some get bitter? Well, obviously, it's not the pain itself that does the magic. It has to be something else. And specifically, it has to be the only thing left, and that is what we do with the pain. It's what we make of it, how we use it. It's whether or not we do use it. This is what really matters. This is what's so often missed. As the prophet Jeremiah says in his own struggles, the ungodly waste their pain. The ungodly waste their pain. This is their mistake. And this is the key, not to waste our pain. To put it another way, life to a very great extent comes down to what we do with our tears. Suffering is a part of life. We may go without it for a season, but no one gets by forever. Some suffer more and some suffer less, and this we do not understand. But what we do know is that in all cases, what we do with our suffering is the crucial question. As we see time and time again, the decisive factor in human life is not the conditions that surround a person, but their response to them. In effect, it all comes down to whether or not we waste our tears. And this is what God, the imagery of the psalmist, is doing here. God is calling us in this text not to waste our own personal tears, not to waste our suffering and our pain, but to instead make good use of it. For this can be life to us. An absolutely crucial required life skill. But how do we do it? A few thoughts on what the author does here. First, the psalmist frees his tears. Christian author Richard Dietz writes, in Big Spring, Texas, where I grew up, a local undertaker named Roy Naley had an irrepressible urge to get people to laugh. Particularly whenever he visited someone in the hospital, he would walk into the patient's room and solemnly pull out a tape measure. Without saying a word, he would then go over and measure the width of the doorway and write the number down on a small pad. He would then measure the length and width of the patient. Invariably, as he stood there with a concerned look on his face, as if thinking, we're going to have a hard time getting the casket out of this room. Roy would then turn and look around with that little twinkle in his eye, and everybody would burst out laughing. It was a very well-known local joke, and his point was always well taken. Don't let this present hardship define your whole life. Don't have everything you are end here, because it doesn't. Don't let your pain define your life. This is something where we begin. As we think about the psalmist's request that God put my tears in your bottle, what this phrase first means is obviously to let go of one's tears, to not hold on to them, to give them away. This is what the author of the text is requesting, that his tears be held by God. That he's looking not to hold on to them, but to let go of them, to free them from his grasp. And this is the first step. So often, we waste our tears. First, because we refuse to free them. Either we hold them in, we push them down, hide them, deny them, pretend like they don't exist. This because somehow we think they're wrong or maybe shameful. Big girls don't cry and men never do. And thus our tears never get out to heal us or to bring us to what could heal us. Even more often, though, we insist on holding on to our tears, never letting go of our pain, making it the center of our whole world, our only world, thus leaving us endlessly sad and bitter or cynical. It's like preacher Joyce Meyer once remarked. She said, I used to have a real problem with self-pity. Every time the devil would hold a pity party, I was the first to RSVP. Are we this way? First RSVP to pity parties. Making our whole lives about the things that plague us. Understand, either way, either repressing our pain or obsessing upon it. Notice what the problem is. We're holding on to our tears. We're letting our pain define our lives and decide our reality. Our lives are stuck there, stopped there somehow, and it's deadly. The psalmist first frees his tears. He is deciding first to get his pain out beyond himself, to refuse to hold on to it. And this is the first thing we need to do as well. To free our tears, get them out beyond ourselves, express them, and then refuse to allow them to define us. Basically, the first question to ask in times of hardship is this: how much am I letting the painful aspects of my life, my tears, rule me? And how might I refuse their hold upon me today? Author Palmer Tinchin, in his book, God Can't Sleep, he offers this reflection. The Hebrew people have a special way of coming together to help people deal with pain, loss, and grief. They call it Shiva, which means 7, or sits of 7. When there is a death, the closest family members come together. They come together and they sit. But they don't sit alone. All their friends and family come and sit with them. They sit until the healing begins. They sit because they want you to know that you're not alone in your sorrow. They sit together for 7 days. And here's what I love about the 7th day. On the 7th day, everyone in the community comes and they walk with the family around the block. The subtle message is, you can begin to live again. We know you hurt and we hurt with you, but you can heal over. Life goes on. Step forth into it. Don't let this pain rule you. Refuse its demand upon you. First step in times of hardship and pain is refusing the whole of our difficulties. The psalmist first frees his tears. He then secondly surrenders his tears. Notice next that the author doesn't simply free his tears, let them go anywhere. Rather, he very deliberately lets go of them by handing them over to God. You keep them, Lord, he says, in effect. He gives his tears. He surrenders his tears to the Lord. Second crucial step. So often when we're having difficulties, our prayer obviously is like, God will take away our trouble. And this is the psalmist's prayer also. He clearly wants his problems fixed. He wants an absence of hardship, He is no idealistic, masochistic holy man or something. He wants his suffering stopped. Yet note the way he goes about it. He doesn't simply ask God to fix everything. Rather, his request is just that God share his pain with him. Specifically, he puts his tears into God's care. Notice that he says, "Put my tears in your bottle." The tradition, as mentioned, is that each person would have their own prayer bottle to collect tears. But that's not what the psalmist is talking about here. He's asking that his tears be put into God's bottle. He's handing his tears over, sharing them with the Lord, and very directly putting them within God's keeping, entrusting them to the Lord. And this is a second crucial step here. Simply put, are we willing to trust our tears to God? To trust our pain to the course that pain that God would have it take? How often does our pain persist indefinitely, never subsiding, because we insist on having our lives, particularly our pain, play out only as we want them to, We're so hung up on control of everything that we never get better. We refuse to surrender our tears to God's will and ways. Think of it this way. How often do you cry? I have to admit, I come from a very weepy family. It takes almost nothing to get the waterworks going. Some old memories. We're always crying. Well, have you ever cried and felt stupid for having done so? Felt embarrassed? Undoubtedly, we have all at times cried and then felt ashamed for having done so. Why? Well, first, building on what themes already noted, because we tend to see fear as a sign of weakness. But secondly, and even more importantly, because crying indicates to us a loss of control. What do we often say to someone who is crying? We say, try to control yourself. Right? We think the goal of life is control, but God wants us to know here that God is saying life isn't about your control, it's about putting me in control. Will you do this? The second question to ask in times of pain and tears: how do I need to hand my life more over to God? How am I trapped in pain because I won't trust a loving God, a God who's desperately trying to reach me with overwhelming blessing this day in the very midst of my tears, transforming them from tears of sorrow into tears of joy and victory? Author Megan Hill writes, "I didn't cry when I learned that I was the parent of a mentally handicapped child. I just sat still and didn't say anything while my husband and I were informed that our 2-year-old daughter, Christy, was, as we suspected, mentally retarded. Go ahead and cry, the doctor advised kindly. It helps prevent serious emotional difficulties. Serious difficulties notwithstanding, I couldn't cry then nor during the months that followed. I was just angry with God. How could God do this to us? When Christy was old enough to attend school, we enrolled her in our neighborhood kindergarten at age 7. It would have been comforting to cry when I left her in that room full of self-assured, eager, and alert 5-year-olds. But again, God had failed us, so I had to be strong. Christy often spent hours upon hours playing by herself, but this moment, when she was the different child among 20, was probably the loneliest she had ever known. However, positive things began to happen to Christy in her school and to her classmates too. When boasting of their accomplishments, Christy's classmates always took pains to praise her as well. Christy got all her spelling words right today, they rejoiced. No one bothered to add that her spelling list was the easiest of anyone's. During Christy's second year in school, she faced a very traumatic experience that frightened her deeply. The big public event of the term was a competition based on the culmination of the year's music and physical education activities. Christy was way behind in both music and motor coordination, and she felt it. She dreaded the day, and my husband and I dreaded it as well. On the day of the program, Christy pretended to be sick. Desperately, I wanted to keep her home. Why let Christy fail in a gymnasium filled with parents and students and teachers? Surely missing this program wouldn't matter. But my conscience wouldn't let me off. So I practically shoved a very pale, reluctant Christy out onto the school bus and proceeded to be sick myself. Just as I had forced my daughter to go to school, now I had to force myself to go to see her at the program. It seemed that it would never be time for Christy's group to perform. When at last they did, I knew Christy had been worried. Her class divided into relay teams. With her limp and slow, clumsy reactions, she would surely hold up her entire team. The performance went surprisingly well, though, until it was time for the gunny sack race. Now, each child had to climb into the sack from a standing position, hop to a goal line, return, and climb out of the sack. I watched Christy standing near the end of her line of players, looking absolutely frantic. But as Christy's turn to go neared, a change took place in her team. Suddenly, the tallest boy in the line stepped behind Christy and placed his hands on her waist. 2 other boys stood a little in front of her. The moment the player in front of Christy stepped from the sack, those 2 boys grabbed the sack and held it open, while the tall boy lifted Christy and dropped her gently into it. A girl in front of Christy took her hand and supported her briefly while Christy gained her balance. She then hopped off, smiling and proud. The children, all on their own, had arranged beforehand how to help Christy. Amid the cheers of teachers, schoolmates, and parents, I crept off by myself to thank God for the warm, understanding people He had brought into our lives who make it possible for my daughter to live like all her fellow human beings. I thank God who hadn't given us the healing we had desired, but who had given us something better. And with that, I finally cried tears of joy. The psalmist, secondly, surrenders his tears. And then from this, third and finally, the psalmist incorporates his tears. And by this, I don't mean that he filed papers to make his pain into a business, although many people have done that, Rather, I mean he incorporates in the sense of making his tears part of something else, part of something bigger, something more than just his pain. Notice again what he says. You have kept count of my tossings, put my tears in your bottle. Are they not in your record? There's this image here of God having some greater collection, some grander memory and gathering of the lives of the whole world. Are they not in your record? The psalmist is seeking to incorporate his tears into some bigger collection, some grander thing of God. And this, I believe, is the final step in not wasting our suffering. Making our tears part of something bigger, something greater than just us. Specifically, making our struggle work something good beyond just our own lives. Notice simply how the psalmist, in the end, in struggling with his own tears, comes eventually to bless others by his struggles. I mean, by his sharing of it, his writing of it, we today are blessed. His tears are finally not at all wasted because they're made to become a blessing for someone else. The point being not that God gave the hardship in order for it to be a blessing to others, but only that their power to destroy is broken when our tears are made to reach out to help someone else. This is the final question to ask. in not wasting our tears? How can I turn this hardship of mine into a blessing for someone else and make it part of something much bigger, God's work of salvation? One author offers the following true story, and he writes, the surgeon sat beside the boy's bed. The boy's parents sat across from him. Tomorrow morning, the surgeon began, I will open up your heart. You'll find Jesus there, the boy interrupted. The surgeon, not much of a man of faith, looked up, annoyed. I'll cut your heart open, he continued, to see how much damage has been done. But when you open my heart, you'll find Jesus there, the boy reiterated. The surgeon looked at the parents, who sat quietly. He continued his explanation of the procedure. When I see how much damage has been done, I'll sew the heart and chest back up and we'll plan what to do next. Again, the boy couldn't keep quiet. But you'll find Jesus in my heart, he said once more. The Bible says that he lives there because he loves us so much and never leaves us no matter what. When you open me up, you'll find Jesus in my heart. The surgeon had had enough. I'll tell you what I'll find in your heart, young man, he fired back. I'll find damaged muscle, low blood supply, and weakened vessels. And I'll find out if I can make you well. And you'll find Jesus there too, the boy chimed in one more time. He lives there. The surgeon left. Later that day, the surgeon sat in his office recording his notes from the surgery. Damaged aorta, damaged pulmonary vein, widespread muscle degeneration, no hope for transplant, no hope for cure, therapy, painkillers and bed rest, prognosis, here he paused, death within 1 year. He stopped his recorder, but there was more to be said. Why? He asked aloud. Why do you do this? You've put him here, you've put him in this pain, and you've cursed him to an early death. Why? The surgeon shook an angry fist at heaven. Suddenly, much to his surprise, the Lord answered him, saying, the boy, my lamb, like all my flock, is there on earth for a time, some more, some less, but he is always with me. And I care and comfort my flock in ways that are beyond your world. Still, the surgeon's anger ran hot. But you created that boy, and you created that heart. He'll suffer greatly and be dead in months. It's cruel. The Lord answered, you don't understand. As with all my flock, when they seek my will, they know my constant embrace no matter where they are. Trust me, the boy, my lamb, knows well my will. And just what exactly is your will? The surgeon sarcastically fired back. The same for all my lambs, God answered. Wherever they are, to reach out to and to rescue the lost lambs. With that, the surgeon began to cry. The next day, the surgeon sat beside the boy's bed. The boy's parents sat across from him. The boy awoke and whispered, did you cut open my heart? And yes, said the surgeon. What did you find? Asked the boy. I found Jesus there, answered the surgeon. And the boy smiled and fell asleep. A prominent pastoral counselor once remarked, do you desire to know the whole art of living? It is contained in one simple phrase, use your tears. Every life is eventually touched by sorrow, by suffering, by tears. It is inevitable. A great life thus consists not in whether or not we can avoid such times, which is impossible, but what we make of them, if we will use them. Do you ever cry? Don't waste your tears. Free them, surrender them, incorporate them.